Welcome to the first lecture in our 1975-76 series of Oriental Institute lectures. Tonight we're especially honored to have with us Professor Samuel Kramer, the Curator Emeritus of Tablet Collections at the University of Pennsylvania and formerly Clark Research Professor of Assyriology at the university there. Now, Professor Kramer, I'm sure, is well known to many of you as author of a series of popular books on the Sumerians, Sumerian mythology, History Begins at Sumer, and the most recent popular book, The Sumerians, and a series of others as well on Sumerian religion and Sumerian ritual and so on. He's known to professional Sumerologists as perhaps the greatest publisher of texts, I think I could say that without exaggeration, in the 20th century for Sumerian literature. Professor Kramer's researches have gone into most countries of the Middle East, or what he's dragged out of the museums in Baghdad and Istanbul. He was one of the first Western scholars to breach the Iron Curtain after the Second World War, to work both in Russia and in East Germany. And much of what we know today about Sumerian literature, on both the popular level and on the scholarly level, we owe to Professor Kramer's tireless researches. I mean, I could go on literally for an hour just describing publications and what Professor Kramer has done for the field of Sumerology. But that isn't what we've come here for tonight. So, without going into much further description of Professor Kramer's career, except to say that he did start it here to a certain extent back in 1932 as research assistant to Professor Pöbel and Professor Chiera, and some of his earliest books in Sumerology were published in our Assyriological Studies series, and he edited some of the books in the Oriental Institute publication series back in the 30s. So in a sense it is, in one way, a homecoming for Professor Kramer tonight. The topic is also particularly apropos. The Sumerian woman, wife, mother, priestess, goddess, something that fits in very well with modern times, even though it's derived from one of the most ancient parts of ancient history. Professor Kramer.
Thank you, Mr. Brinkman. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your generous introduction. As you have heard from Dr. Brinkman, the Oriental Institute is in a large way, spiritually speaking, my second home. It was here in the early 1930s, that I first read a Sumerian text from a master of Sumerology at that time by the name of Arno Pöbel, whose name you've mentioned, who was at that time associate editor of the CAD. I won't keep on repeating Chicago Assyrian Dictionary, but I'm sure you all know of that real magnum opus that is being produced by Chicago, the CAD. So he was at that time the associate editor, and I knew nothing about Sumerian until he taught me how to read a text and try to translate it. Even more so, I got my first glimpse of Sumerian literature, my first look at a document that was Sumerian literature in the same early 1930s, in the same room in the Oriental Institute, from Edward Chiera, who was at that time the editor-in-chief of the CAD. Now, Chiera had been for many years a professor at Penn, at the University of Pennsylvania. And Chiera had copied hundreds of Sumerian literary tablets in the University Museum of the University of Pennsylvania. And when he was called by Henry Breasted to head up the dictionary here, he brought with him these copies, and with the promise that they would be published by the Oriental Institute. And unfortunately, he met an untimely death, I think 1934 or something like that. And the copies, Kiera's copies, were left stranded, as it were, orphaned. And because I was an up-and-coming young Sumerologist working with Purble at the time, the editorial department of the Oriental Institute asked me to publish these copies posthumously. And as I studied these copies and looked at Kiera's notes and realized his identifications, it was the source of inspiration for me to continue his work, as it were, and to devote my entire career to something that he had dreamed of, something about Sumerian literature which unfortunately he was cut off from by fate. So again, you see, this is not only a second homecoming to me, this is the Oriental Institute is in a large sense responsible for the nature of my researches, for its direction, for their direction, and for their evolution. And I'm eternally grateful for it. However, yes, something else. In the late 1940s, when Torkel Jacobsen was director of the Oriental Institute, he and I joined forces and were instrumental in organizing an expedition to ancient Nippur, which you'll see signs of which you will note in your museum, to ancient Nippur. And it was a joint expedition sponsored by the Oriental Institute and the University Museum. And in its very first seasons, it found hundreds of Sumerian literary tablets, which proved to be very significant for the reconstruction of certain Sumerian literary texts. But enough of this reminiscing and this nostalgic feeling, and let's go to the work at hand, which is an essay, a paper that I will read to you on the status of the Sumerian woman. By and large, I am known as an extreme specialist. I've sat around for many days, many hours, many years in various museums copying texts, trying to identify, trying to piece together their contents, writing preliminary translations. So in one sense, I'm an extreme specialist. But in more recent years, as I grew older, I become a bit more anthropologically oriented. And I try to squeeze out from these Sumerian literary texts, I try to squeeze out whatever they can reveal about Sumerian society and about Sumerian culture in general, and the psychological aspects of Sumerian culture. Unfortunately for me, or perhaps fortunately in some respects, the chaps who wrote, the authors of the Sumerian literary documents, were not scholarly oriented sociologists. They were visionary poets and emotional bards. So whatever you have to learn about society, you have to read between the lines and work inferentially and indirectly, as I hope to show you in the present essay that I shall read to you on the status of woman, and as I hope it will attest and confirm that if one works in a certain way, one can get a good deal out of Sumerian literature, something that the authors themselves didn't much expect. The paper that I will read to you, and I will read it to you, but don't be scared, it won't be too bad, because I can't ad-lib. And I have a lot of quotations, and I'm not very good at ad-libbing. So the paper that I will read to you will begin with an account of the deterioration of women's rights as it is revealed by a certain number of documents from the second half of the third millennium BC. And the paper will then continue with a sketch of the victimization of the female deities by the male theologians who tried to take away some of their powers and turn them over to the male gods. And finally, it will close with a rather surprising and anomalous and ambivalent role, with the anomalous, ambivalent role played by the Sumerian mother, especially in relation to her sons. For that, there will be extracts. I will read you extracts from certain texts as evidence, but especially one poem in which an affectionate son writes to his mother and depicts her as an ideal woman, as the ideal woman of his dreams. So if you keep those three aspects of the paper in mind, I shall now try to read it to you. From time to time, in recent years, it has occurred to me that in view of today's pervading concern with the diverse and variegated social ills that mark and mar modern life, it might be useful and illuminating to determine whether or not some of these disturbing problems troubled ancient Sumerian society as well. When, therefore, in 1970, the 18th International Assyriological Association announced that the central theme of its meetings would be the nature and character of the societies of the ancient Near East, I prepared a paper that has since been published in the proceedings of that Congress, entitled Modern Social Problems in Ancient Sumer, which demonstrated, or at least tried to demonstrate, with evidence, that not unlike our own tormented society, the Sumerian society of some 4,000 years ago had its deplorable failings and its distressing shortcomings. It vaunted utopian ideals, honored more in the breach than in observance. It suffered from a gap between Sunday preaching and Monday practice. It yearned for peace and was constantly at war. It professed such noble virtues as justice, equity, and compassion, but it abounded in injustice, inequality, and oppression. Materialistic and short-sighted, it unbalanced its ecology, the ecology essential to its economy. It was afflicted by a generation gap between parents and children and by student-teacher confrontation. It had its dropouts, its cop-outs, its hippies, and its perverts. Now, this highly competitive and to a large extent, hypocritical, unjust, oppressive, even genocidal Sumerian society resembled our own society in one other significant aspect, namely, it was male-dominated. Men ran the government, managed the economy, administered the courts and schools, manipulated the theology and ritual. Women were second-class citizens without power, prestige, and status. However, this seemed to be predominantly true of Sumerian society only from about 2000 BC. In earlier days, the Sumerian woman perhaps was man's equal, at least socially and economically. As for religion, the female deity was venerated and worshipped from the earliest times to the very end of Sumer's existence, in spite of numerous manipulative attempts by chauvinistic male theologians. God in Sumer never became all male. First, then, deterioration of women's rights from earlier times. Let us begin with women's rights and status in early Sumer. Sometime about 2350 BC, a king by the name of Urukagina reigned in a city-state called Lagash, one of Sumer's important city-states. Now, many of Urukagina's inscriptions were excavated by the French almost 100 years ago, and these have been deciphered and translated so that we know pretty well their contents. That was not my doing. Among these documents is a reform document in which Urukagina purports to depict the evils of, quote, former days, that is, of the years preceding his reign, as well as the measures that he introduced to alleviate these evils. Now, one of these reforms reads as follows, quote, the women of former days used to take 2 husbands, but the women of today, when they attempted to do this, are stoned with stones inscribed with their evil intent. To judge from this rather strident boast, women in pre-Urukagina days practiced polyandry, or at least some of them, and this hardly smacks of a male-dominated society. Or take the case of Baranamtara, the wife of Urukagina's immediate predecessor, a chap by the name of Lugalanda. Now, quite a number of administrative documents concerned with this lady Baranamtara have been uncovered, and these seem to indicate that she managed her own estates and even sent diplomatic missions to her counterpart in neighboring city-states without consulting her husband. Even Urukagina, who because of his uptight reaction to polyandry might perhaps be stigmatized as the first sexist in recorded history, even he was not that all anti-feminine. His wife Shakshak, for example, like her predecessor Baranamtara, was the mistress of vast estates and ran her affairs every bit her husband's equal. In fact, Urukagina might well be acclaimed as the first man to favor equal pay for equal work regardless of sex, because one of the remedial measures that he proudly records in the above-mentioned reform document concerns the bureaucratic gouging of the bereaved by officials in charge of a funeral. In pre-Urukagina days, reads the document, when a citizen was brought to a certain type of high-class cemetery, the reeds of Enki, when it was brought there for burial, there were on hand 3 male officials who received a considerable amount of beer, bread, and barley, as well as a bed and a chair, as compensation for their services. But Urukagina decreed, says this reform, that the food rations of the 3 male attendants be reduced, and that the furniture bonus be eliminated altogether. At the same time, he ordered that a woman, a priestess known as Nindingia, literally means Lady Divine, that priestess, who formerly received no remuneration, be given a headband and a jar of scented ointment, as compensation for her services, a payment that compared not unfavorably with that received by her male colleagues. This Nindingia was not the only priestess who played a significant role in the cult. A more prominent and more important lady was the high priestess known by the Sumerian word Ain, which means high priest or high priestess. According to Sumerian religious practice, the major temple in each large city had its Ain, who was male, its high priest who was male, if the deity worshipped in that temple was female, and the high priest was female, that is a high priestess, if the deity worshipped was male. Now, quite a number of these high priestesses are known to us by name, beginning with about 2300 BC, a generation or two after the days of the above-mentioned Urukagina. The first of these is Enlil, the daughter of Sargon the Great, one of the outstanding Semitic rulers of the ancient world. This Enlil was high priestess in Ur, the city known in the Bible as Ur of the Chaldees, the home of the patriarch Abraham, where the main deity was the moon god Nanasin. But not only was she the spiritual head of one of Sumer's largest temples, she was also a poet and author of renown. Quite recently, 2 of her poetic works have been made available to the scholarly world. One is a large collection of hymns to the temples of Sumer that was pieced together from some 30 tablets and fragments and edited in 1969 by Professor Ilke Scherberg of the University Museum in Philadelphia. The other is a highly poetic hymnal prayer to the goddess Inanna that was pieced together from 50 tablets and fragments and edited in 1968 by William Hallow of the Yale University and Van Dyck of the Biblical Institute in Rome. So that here in Sumer, almost 4,500 years ago, it was possible for a woman, at least if she was a princess, to hold top rank among the literati of the land and to be a spiritual leader of paramount importance. So from this early period, doesn't look so bad for the girls. From the 3 centuries following the days of Enlil, however, little is known about Sumerian society and the status of women. But from about 2000 BC, there have been uncovered a large number of legal documents and court decisions of diverse content. And these have been studied in great detail by the late great Sumerologist of Heidelberg, Adam Falkenstein. From these legal documents, we learn that the role of woman had deteriorated considerably, and that on the whole it was the male who ruled the roost. Marriage, for example, was theoretically monogamous, but the husband was permitted to have 1 or more concubines, while the wife had to stay faithful to her one and only spouse. To be sure, a married woman could own property and other possessions, could sometimes buy and sell without consulting her husband, and on rare occasions could make special conditions in the marriage contract. In case of divorce, however, the husband had the upper hand. He could divorce his wife virtually at will, although if he did so without showing good cause, he had to pay her sometimes as much as a mina of silver, which is no mean sum in those days. But it was not only on the human plane that the woman had lost some of her rights and prerogatives to the so-called sexists, you might say, of 2000 BC. It also happened on the divine plane. And here I must ask you to bear with me, because this is a little more complicated than the usual stuff. Nevertheless, I think it'll be clear to most of you. Some of the female deities that had been at top rank of the Sumerian pantheon, or close to the top rank, they were gradually forced down from the hierarchical ladder by the male theologians, who seem to have manipulated the order of the divinities in accordance with their masculine predilections. The goddesses, however, were no pushovers. More determined and aggressive than their human counterparts, they struggled to hold or regain at least part of their deprived supremacy to the very end of Sumer's existence as a political entity, which was about 1750 BC. What is more, at least one of the goddesses, Inanna, that means literally Queen of Heaven, Inanna continued to be predominant and preeminent in the land to the very last, although the theologians ranked her only 7th in the divine hierarchy. The texts are not too explicit on the subject, but with a bit of between-the-line reading and burrowing, it is now possible to follow the struggling careers of several of the more important female deities and to trace some of their ups and downs in theology and cult. And this is where I beg for your attention. The female deity that seems to have suffered the sharpest decline was a deity by the name of Namu, the goddess of the primeval sea, who, according to some texts, was the creator of the universe and the mother of the gods. By all genealogical rights, therefore, had the theologians played it fair, she would have had top billing in the Sumerian pantheon. But in the later god lists, where the deities are arranged in hierarchical order, she is rarely mentioned and never at the head of the list. Moreover, her vast powers as the goddess of the sea were turned over to a male deity by the name of Anki, about whom I'll speak a little bit later, who was then designated by the theologians as the son of Namu, in an apparent attempt to mitigate and justify this bit of priestly larceny. Even so, even though she was deprived of much of her power, of much of her prestige, the king who founded the third dynasty of Ur and ushered in a political and cultural renaissance about 2050 BC, that king chose as his royal name Ur-Namu, which means servant of Namu, which shows that the goddess was still worshipped and adored even by the mighty of the land. But it is Namu's daughter Ki, whose gradual decline can be followed almost step by step with the help of the ancient texts. As noted earlier, the sea goddess Namu was conceived as the creator of the universe. Now, the Sumerian word for universe is a compound word, Anki, where An, the first syllable, An, means heaven or father heaven, and Ki means earth or mother earth. It was, according to the dogma of the Sumerian theologians, it was the sexual union of father heaven with mother earth that, according to the Sumerian theologians, ushered in the birth of the gods unto their generations. Now, the first to be born of this heaven-earth union was the air god, the god of atmosphere, whose name is Enlil, which means literally Lord Air. And it was he, this Lord Air, who by making use of his atmospheric powers succeeded in separating heaven from earth, or father heaven from mother earth, and thus prepared the way for the creation of vegetation and all living things, including man. Now, in view of these theological premises and postulates, the leading deities of the pantheon, once the sea goddess Namu, had been deprived of her supremacy. But the order should have read, by all reason, should have been ranked as follows, namely, An, father heaven, Ki, earth, Enlil, who was born of them, Lord Air, should be third. And this may perhaps have been so in very early times. We have no evidence. But by 2400 BC, when the relevant inscriptional evidence first becomes available, we find the leading deities of the pantheon regularly arranged in the following order. An, heaven, which you expect, but not Ki, earth. Instead of that, second place comes Enlil, Lord Air. And then we get a lady by the name of Ninhursag, which means literally Queen of the Mountain. And then Enki, which literally means the Lord of the earth. He is fourth. So on the surface, we don't find Ki earth at all there, but we do find a lady by the name of Ninhursag. Now, what has happened was that the theologians, seemingly uncomfortable and unhappy with a female deity as the ruler of so important a cosmic entity as Earth, had taken this power away from her and transferred it to the male Enlil, who, as one poet puts it, carried off the earth, carried off Mother Earth after he had separated her from heaven. And that was no. After taking away from the goddess the rulership over the earth, the theologians also deprived her of her name Ki, earth, since it no longer accorded with her reduced status. Instead, they called her by one of her several epithets, Ninchulsag, which, as I noted, means Queen of Heaven, and demoted her to third place in the pantheon. But the worst was yet to come. Even worse, even third place was deemed too high, and she was finally reduced to fourth place, third going to Anki, whose name literally means Lord of the Earth. Now this God's name was actually a misnomer, since he had charge only of the seas and rivers. And even this power, as I noted earlier, he had usurped from the goddess Namu. But the theologians of Eridu, a city in southern Sumer, which was that god's Enki's main seat of worship, they were consumed with ambition for their god. And as the name Lord of the Earth indicates, they were really out to topple the god Enlil, who had become ruler of the earth after he had separated her from heaven. To achieve their goal, they went so far as to create a myth in which they have their god Enki confound the speech of man and turn it into a babel of tongues in order to break up Enlil's universal sway over mankind that worship to him in one tongue. That's your first example of a babel of tongues. In this, however, they failed, since Enlil's bailiwick was Nippur, Sumer's holy city and cultural center. It's where you're digging, by the way, now in Nippur. I'm in the Oriental Institute, not you. And its theologians were too powerful. Disappointed and frustrated, the theologians of Eridu turned upon the female Ninchulsag, whose supporters were too weak, evidently, to prevent the victimization. And so by 2000 BC, when the pertinent texts become available once again, the order of the four leading deities of the pantheon is no longer An, Enlil, Ninchulsag, Enki, but rather An, Enlil, Enki, and Ninchulsag is down in the fourth place. Still, as I noted above, the Sumerian goddesses did not take male domination lying down, and not infrequently they registered their resentment in no uncertain manner and showed the male victors who was really boss. As of today, for example, we have two myths in which Ninchulsag, this lady that had been demoted to fourth place, and Enki, who had usurped her place, in which these two are the main protagonists. And in both, it is Ninchulsag who dominates the action, with Enki playing second fiddle. The scene of one of these tales is Dillman, the Sumerian divine paradise land, where both Ninchulsag and Enki were at home. Here, after much planning and doing, in Dillman, after much planning and doing, Ninchulsag finally succeeded in making 8 different plants sprout. But when Enki sees these 8 different plants, they tempt his appetite, and he sends his vizier to pluck them and bring them to him so that he might eat them. He then proceeds to eat them one at a time, and this so enrages Ninchulsag that she pronounces upon him the, quote, curse of death. And mighty male though he was, his 8 organs became sick. The failing Enki would surely have died in due course had not the goddess finally taken pity on him and created 8 special deities, each of whom healed one of Enki's diseased organs. In the other available myth, we find Ninchulsag and Enki, the same 2 deities, acting as partners in the creation of man quote, from the clay that is over the deep. They took the clay that is over the deep for the creation of man. Now, in the course of a banquet of the gods to celebrate this, the two deities, Enki and Ninhursag, become tipsy, and the partnership turns into a competition. First, Ninhursag creates 6 malformed creatures, and Enki dutifully blesses them and even finds useful jobs for each one of the handicapped creations. Then it was Enki's turn, but the creature that he fashions out of clay displeased Ninhursag, who proceeds to rebuke Enki bitterly for his clumsy effort. And the god seems to accept the rebuke as his due in language obsequious and flattering. Nor was Ninhursag the only female deity who, in spite of male victimization, continued to be revered and adored in the land. There was Nidaba, the patroness of writing, learning, and accounting, who was specially chosen by a king by the name of Lugal-Zagisi, who was a contemporary of the Urukagina that I had mentioned earlier. This Nidaba this lady goddess was especially chosen by Lugal-Zagisi as his personal deity, his protective angel, as it were, to guide and protect him. And even more important was the goddess Nanshe, Sumer's social conscience, as it were. The poets depict her as a just but not unkindly judge of all mankind, as a deity who searched the heart of the people, who cared for the orphan and widow, who knew the oppression, I quote, who knew the oppression of man over man, who sought out justice for the poor, quote, turned the strong over to the weak, brought the refugee to her lap. And every new year, this goddess Nanshe convened the courts of judgment, and with Nidaba, the goddess of writing, at her side to do the writing and recording, she castigated the evildoers and transgressor and turned them over to her bailiff, who was a male, for punishment. But the goddess that really avenged, may be said to have avenged her sisters and assuaged some of their resentment, was Inanna, this queen of heaven that I mentioned earlier, whose powers and deeds were glorified and extolled throughout Sumer's existence, in myth, in epic, and in hymn. And no wonder, because Inanna combined a well-nigh unbeatable ambivalence in her dual nature as the goddess of love and war, of sexual passion, and of the violence of battle. Early in her career, about 3000 BC, she took over the divine rule of the important city-state of Erech from the theoretically all-powerful god An. In an effort to make her city Erech the center of civilized life, she braved a dangerous journey to the deep, where all the cultural norms and values were guarded by the sea god Enki, and she brought them safely to her joyous city. When a northern rebellious highland by the name of Abich failed to show her due honor, she virtually destroyed it with her fiery weapons and brought it to her knees. Raped by a gardener by the name of Shukali Tuda, while sleeping wearily after a long cosmic journey under one of his shade trees, she pursued him relentlessly and finally killed him, though she consoled him by saying that she will make his name endure in story and song. But the role Inanna delighted in most was the one that guaranteed her the affection and veneration of every Sumerian heart, and that was the role which she played in the so-called sacred marriage rite that celebrated her sexual union with the king of Sumer in order to ensure the fertility of the soil and the fecundity of the womb. The first king whom the goddess selected as her spouse was probably Dumuzi, the biblical Tammuz, who reigned early in the 3rd millennium BC. And from then on, many, if not most, of the rulers of Sumer celebrated their marriage to the goddess as incarnations of Dumuzi. Throughout the sacred marriage ceremony, it was the goddess who was the active, dominant protagonist. The king was but the passive, ecstatic recipient. He was the recipient of the blessings of her womb and breasts, as well as of a touch of her immortality. And when, so tell the Sumerian mythographers, when Dumuzi, in typical male arrogance, became weary of playing second fiddle to the goddess, and in her absence began to act high and mighty, she fastened upon him her eye of death and had him carried off to the netherworld. And there he would have remained forever, had not his loving sister Inanna offered herself as his substitute, which allowed him to return to earth for half the year. Not only was Inanna Queen of Heaven, which is the literal meaning of her name, she was also Lady of the Evening Star, and the poets loved to sing of her coming out radiantly at evening time and filling the heavens with bright light like a holy torch. Every month at new moon, the gods of heaven and earth, so say the hymns, male as well as female, assembled about her and knelt before her with offerings, prayers, while she renders the judgment of the Lamb. That was a quote, while she renders the judgments of the Lamb and proclaims the divine decisions as her people parade before her. The adoration of Inanna as the evening star by all living creatures and even by verdant vegetation is depicted by the poets in such psalm-like lines as the following. At evening, the radiant star, the great light that fills the sky, the Lady of the Evening, bravely comes forth out of heaven. The people in all the lands lift their eyes to her. The men purify themselves, the women cleanse themselves, the ox in his yoke lows to her. The beasts, the multitudinous of the plain, the living creatures of the steppe, and the four-legged creatures of the high steppe bow before her. All these, the lush orchards and gardens, the verdant reeds and trees, the fish of the deep, the birds of heaven, all these, my lady makes them all hurry to their sleeping places. The living creatures, the people, the multitudinous, bend the knees before her. My lady refreshes herself in the land. There is play in the land, the festive. The young man, quote, soothes the hearts of a spouse, while my lady looks on in wonder from heaven's midst. So much for Inanna, the beloved, and I might say in quotes, holy terror, the beloved holy terror of the ancient masculine world. As is clear from all that has been said above, the female deity had her ups and downs in Sumerian religion, but she was never really licked nor eclipsed by her male rivals. Even in later days, when Sumer had been conquered by the Babylonians and the Sumerian language was superseded by the Semitic Akkadian tongue, even then the poets continued to compose hymns and psalms to some of the female deities, and especially to Inanna under her Semitic name Ishtar. The death knell of the female principle in religious worship came with the birth of monotheism, and especially with Yahwistic monotheism, the Yahwistic monotheism propagated by the Hebrew prophets. For them, Yahweh was not only omnipotent, but also all-male, and there was no room for any goddess, no matter how minimal her power and how irreproachable her conduct. Still, even in Yahwistic Judaism, there are faint echoes of the female divinity of earlier days, and it is not altogether surprising to find that the Hebrew mystics, the Kabbalists, spoke of a feminine element in Yahweh designated as the Shekinah, as opposed to a masculine element designated in translation as the Holy One, blessed be he. And at least one passage in the renowned Kabbalistic book, the Zohar, at least one passage states that Moses, the man of God, actually had intercourse with the Shekinah, which is a distant but not so faint reminder of the sacred marriage ceremony between Dumuzi and the goddess Inanna. So far, I have discussed the status of woman in Sumer as wife, as priestess, as goddess. Let me now turn to the Sumerian woman as mother and her rather anomalous and ambivalent relations with her son. To judge from the available texts, she was thought of by the Sumerians as a rather harsh scold whom the son feared and disliked. When, for example, Gudea, the well-known Sumerian Ensi, I think you have a statue of him in your museum, the well-known Sumerian Ensi who lived about 2100 BC, when he was chosen as the ruler of the city-state of Lagash, one of the reforms he found it noteworthy to inscribe in his monuments was that he saw to it that, and I quote, that the mother did not strike the son. And when he founded, the same Gudea found it necessary to purify the city morally and spiritually in order to make it a fit place for his newly restored temple, the Eninu, he made sure that, and I quote, that the mother scolded not the son, and that the son spoke not disrespectfully to his mother. A century after Gudea, similarly, King Shulgi of Ur, the city I mentioned earlier, who lived less than a century after Gudea, he claims that during his reign, the mother speaks kindly to the son, and the son answers truthfully to the father. And about a century and a half later, a king by the name of Ishmadagan boasts that during his glorious reign, I quote, brother speaks the truth to brother, the father is respected, the older sister is not contradicted, and finally, the mother is feared. Rather strange. Nanshe, that goddess I mentioned before, when this goddess Nanshe, among the sinners and reprobates, that this goddess Nanshe examined at New Year's in order to punish them, among those reprobates were the mother who spoke violently to her son, and the son who spoke hatefully to his mother. Now that's very surprising, especially in what I'm going to say now. In striking contrast to this unprepossessing portrayal of the mother-son relationship is a Sumerian poem that purports to be a message sent by a loving, affectionate son named Ludingira, the literal meaning of which is man of God, sent by this affectionate son Ludingira to his mother, whom he describes in extravagant metaphorical language as the ideal woman. Beautiful, radiant, diligent, productive, gracious, joyous, even sweet-smelling. The poem was first edited in 1964 by Miguel Civil, now professor in the Oriental Institute, and was published in the Journal of Near Eastern Studies. In 1967, the eminent French cuneiformist Jean Nouguereau, recently deceased, published a large fragment of a tablet excavated in Ugarit, that originally contained the entire text of the poem written in Sumerian, with translations into Akkadian and into Hittite. Nugarol's careful, thorough study added considerably to the understanding of the text. In 1970, in the course of studying several hundred still unpublished tablets, Sumerian literary tablets and fragments in Istanbul's Museum of the Ancient Orient, Muazzez Ç, the curator of the tablet collection of that museum, and I, who were studying them together, came across a well-preserved duplicate of the document that adds a number of significant readings. Now this poem begins with a brief introductory passage in which Ludingara, the son and purported author of the poem, this son informs an unnamed royal courier that he, that is the son, has traveled a long way from Nippur. There's Nippur again. Traveled a long way from Nippur, where lives his mother, who is very much worried about his welfare, and that he is therefore sending him with a letter of greeting to her. And these introductory lines read, "Royal courier, ever on the road, I would send you to Nippur. Deliver this message. I have traveled a long way. My mother is troubled, unable to sleep. She whose chamber the angry word is barred keeps asking travelers about my welfare. Put my letter of greeting in her hand, in the hand of my mother, who will have adorned herself joyously for you." Since, however, the mother was a stranger to the courier, who wouldn't know her if he saw her, Ludingara gives him 5 signs to guide him in identifying her. Actually, none of these signs are specific and precise enough to serve their purpose. Their introduction in the poem is a literary device utilized by the author to enable him to portray the ideal mother, the mother of his dreams, as it were. The first of the signs relates primarily to her extraordinary accomplishments as wife and daughter-in-law, and reads as follows, the first sign. "If you know not my mother, let me give you these signs. My mother is a figure radiant, limbs and body resplendent, a goddess fair, a daughter-in-law delightful, blessed from the days of her youth. By her energy she has managed well the house of the father-in-law. Vigilant, she has multiplied possessions. She who is beloved, cherished, full of life." So much for the first sign. The second sign that Ludingara gives the courier depicts the mother's outstanding beauty in hyperbolic language. "Let me give you a second sign concerning my mother. My mother is a bright light in the horizon, a mountain dove, the morning star most bright, a precious carnelian stone, a topaz of Mahashiland, a jewel of princess, full of allure, carnelian jewels, joyous, beautiful, a ring of tin, a bracelet of iron, a staff of gold, of bright silver, a perfect ivory figurine full of charm, an angel of alabaster set on a lapis lazuli pedestal." Sounds more like a statue than of a human being. Ludingara next portrays, and that has a point to it, which I will not discuss with you now, but you can dispute it among yourself when you leave this. That it has an important point, but I said that this may be a statue rather than a human being, of flesh and blood. Ludingara next, but I'm reading it to you as the poet gives it, flesh and blood. Ludingara next portrays her mother metaphorically as the fertility of field and garden. Thus, "Let me give you my mother's third sign. My mother is rain in its season, water for the prime seeds, a rich harvest, the finest barley, a garden of plenty, full of joy, a well-watered fir tree, a fir tree adorned. The fruit of the new year, the yield of the first month. She is a river carrying the fertilizing water to the irrigating canals. She is a Dillman date, most sweet. Dillman is that divine paradise land. A Dillman date, most sweet. A prime date, much sought after. In the fourth sign, Ludingara seems to draw his images primarily from festal occasions. Let me give you a fourth sign concerning my mother. My mother is a feast, brimful of joyous offerings. She is a New Year offering, wondrous to behold, a dancing place made for much rejoicing, procreation of princes, a chant of abundance, a lover, a loving heart whose joy is never sated, good news, a captive returned to happiness. Fragrance is the theme of Ludingara's last and fifth sign, which is very brief. And he says, let me give you a fifth sign concerning my mother. My mother is a chariot of pine, a litter of boxwood, a goodly garment perfumed with oil, a phial of ostrich shell, the inside filled with prime oil, a delightful garland fitted out luxuriantly. And finally, Ludingara ends his address to the courier with these words. The signs imparted to you, I have given you their shape. To the lady most fair, the possessor of angels, to her who is my mother, to her who is all wise, bring this letter joyfully and say to her, Ludingara, your loving son, sends you his greetings. And that's how the poem ends. And how different that is from the previous text, from the earlier text that I read, which seemed to think of the mother as a skull. And you tried to find that out yourself. Well, this finishes my paper. Before stepping down from the podium, however, I would like to say, and I would like to stress and emphasize, that this paper on the Sumerian woman is by no means comprehensive and far, far, far from exhaustive. In fact, it is nothing more than a preliminary pioneer study of certain aspects of the status of woman. There's a good reason to hope that in the next years, a much fuller and rounder picture of the Sumerian woman will be forthcoming, will see the light of publication. And unless I'm very much mistaken, it's the Oriental Institute that will play the leading role in this process of publication about the woman. At the very present moment, one of the professors in the Oriental Institute, is preparing a definitive edition of a number of Sumerian documents, which in the trade is called disputations. And these disputations are the closest thing we have to what you might call sociological studies. They will illuminate immensely the society of ancient Sumer. Now, one of these disputations is a vituperative debate between two women, not of the aristocratic class, not of the ruling class, which is the type of woman I have discussed mostly in this paper, but of the common ordinary woman. And it's a vituperative disputation between them, and there is no doubt in my mind that they will present the status of woman in a much more surprising way than I have done here. In the Oriental Institute, there's also a sociological study going on for the very earliest period in which the sociology of the woman and so on will play a role. And then there are these immense files, these vast files of the Oriental Institute for the CAD, for the Chicago Assyrian Dictionary. These files must be full of passages mentioning in one way or another, speaking in one way or another about the Sumerian woman. And once they are collected, analyzed, synthesized, there's every reason that they will present a relatively full picture of the woman from from earliest times right down to the beginning of the Christian era. So that you can see from my remarks that the future of the Sumerian and Mesopotamian woman is in the hands of the Oriental Institute. And unless I'm very much mistaken, to judge from past experience, it will not let her down and will do her proud.
We will try very hard not to let the Sumerian woman down, believe me. Thank you very much, Professor Kramer, for a most interesting and informative lecture. In practice with Sumerian custom before 2300 BC, we would now like to invite all members, female and male, to come to the reception in the museum halls of the Institute. Good evening.